The Galactic Council's official declaration of war against humanity arrived precisely at 8:32 Earth Standard Time. By 8:35, someone at the United Nations had already marked it as spam. The transmission was elaborate, filled with ceremonial threats and grave speeches about the reckless expansion of an uncontrollable and dangerous species. The Council, an alliance of the most dominant civilizations in the known galaxy, had convened with great formality to issue the decree. They expected Earth to react with fear or, at the very least, a plea for negotiations. Instead, humanity barely noticed. The first attack came a week later, when an Allery battleship fired a warning salvo at a group of human mining vessels orbiting an asteroid belt near Proxima Centauri. The result was catastrophic, but not for the miners. The battleship was obliterated in under 20 seconds. Unbeknownst to the Allery, the mining rigs, owned by private corporations with no concept of restraint, were armed with mass driver cannons powerful enough to pierce capital ships. The Allery vessel was reduced to molten debris, its emergency distress beacon the only thing left transmitting. The Council scrambled to understand what had happened. Reports flooded in, each more alarming than the last. Humanity had not deployed a single military ship in response. They hadn't mobilized. They hadn't even acknowledged the war. They simply continued mining, transporting, and trading as if nothing had changed. A second strike force was dispatched to the Jovian shipyards, a major hub of human shipbuilding. The Council anticipated a fierce battle or, at the very least, defensive preparations. Instead, their fleet was met with complete indifference. The shipyard foreman, a grizzled ex-merchant named Holt, merely squinted at the alien warships before opening a communication channel. "You in the wrong system, boys," he asked, sipping his coffee. "This is an act of war," the Hagen fleet commander bellowed, his multiple eyes glistening with rage. "Surrender your facilities at once." "Yeah, no," Holt replied and muted the channel to take another sip. The fleet opened fire. Or rather, they tried. Their targeting systems malfunctioned, missile locks failed, and energy weapons inexplicably lost power. Humanity had done nothing. It was simply the effect of entering a region saturated with quantum interference, advanced electronic warfare fields, and signal jammers designed to prevent corporate espionage. The technology was so ingrained in human infrastructure that most engineers barely remembered it was there. The disoriented Council fleet found themselves easy prey for the shipyard's automated defenses. Holt never even looked up from his coffee as orbital cannons shredded the warships with precise, methodical efficiency. The surviving vessels fled, their captains too bewildered to comprehend what had just happened. By the time news reached the Council, it was clear something was terribly wrong with their war strategy. Humanity was not reacting with diplomacy, surrender, or even military retaliation. They were simply continuing business as usual while Council fleets were being effortlessly dismantled by infrastructure defenses and civilian contractors. An emergency session was called. The Grand Arbiter, a towering Zeli elder with centuries of strategic experience, addressed the gathered representatives. "We have gravely underestimated humanity's preparedness for war," he admitted. "Their military has not even engaged us, and yet we are suffering severe losses. Their industrial sector is so heavily fortified that what we considered civilian targets have proven more lethal than our warships. We must strike at their homeworld directly." An enraged delegate from the Varan Dominion roared. "They cannot ignore planetary bombardment." The room fell silent. Some of the more cautious members shifted uncomfortably. "You propose an assault on Earth itself?" the Arbiter asked slowly. "Have you not studied their history?" "I fail to see the issue," the delegate scoffed. "Their fleets are inactive, their capital cities unprotected. We can crush their seat of power in a single decisive strike." The Arbiter sighed, closing his many eyes for a long moment before signaling his attendance. A data feed appeared, streaming reports from past centuries. "Let us consider their past responses to existential threats," he said. "When attacked by their own kind, they retaliated with overwhelming force. When faced with superior opponents, They adapted, evolving warfare strategies in years rather than centuries. When confronted with a technological disadvantage, they closed the gap with terrifying speed. He gestured to a set of classified files detailing humanity's hidden military capabilities. They had not expanded their interstellar forces traditionally, but their defensive platforms, automated response networks, and corporate-run mercenary fleets outclassed nearly every military in the galaxy. The reason their war fleets have not engaged us, the Arbiter continued, is because they do not need to. They do not see us as a credible threat. Silence. Then a hesitant voice spoke. If they are so powerful, why have they not sought to conquer us? The Arbiter chuckled, shaking his head. Conquer? They are too occupied with profits, industrial expansion, and automation to waste time on conquest. You think they are apathetic? No. They simply have no reason to consider us worth the effort. A deep, uneasy quiet settled over the chamber. Then what do we do? Someone finally asked. The Arbiter folded his arms. We must make them notice us before they accidentally destroy us entirely. Attempts to force a response from Earth were indirect at first. Some species pushed for economic sanctions, but they failed from the start. Humanity's interstellar corporations operated independently, often competing with one another as fiercely as they did against foreign entities. The Council's trade restrictions barely affected them. Embargoed goods were quickly replaced through alternative supply chains. Worse, opportunistic human conglomerates profited from the sanctions, selling restricted materials through subsidiaries and black market channels. Desperation mounted. The next move was sabotage. Council operatives attempted to hack financial networks, plant explosives in shipyards, and disrupt communication relays. The results were disastrous, but not for humanity. Automated counter-surveillance systems caught most infiltrators before they could act, while corporate security forces, many with years of experience in corporate espionage, neutralized the rest. Within weeks, every Council asset operating within human space was either dead, captured, or in hiding. Most concerning was the aftermath. Humanity did not react with fury or diplomatic outrage. Instead, they filed insurance claims. Industries continued operating as if nothing had happened. Their infrastructure was so redundant and resilient that sabotage barely made a dent. If one shipyard was damaged, a dozen others absorbed the workload. If one trade network was disrupted, shipments were rerouted before any losses were felt. Interference with commercial activity detected. Fines for disruption of registered shipping lanes will be issued. Please comply with interstellar commerce regulations. The fleet commander was at a loss. He had led invasions, besieged empires. But here he was threatening a human colony that only acknowledged his presence by filing paperwork. When he reported back, the Council was in disbelief. The final straw came when an elite strike team attempted to infiltrate Earth itself. Their mission was to seize key government officials and force negotiations. The plan failed immediately. Their landing pods were intercepted before they reached the surface, redirected to secure holding facilities without a single shot fired. The soldiers braced for brutal interrogation, perhaps even torture. Instead, they were greeted by corporate executives, legal representatives, and insurance adjusters. They were not treated as prisoners of war, but as trespassers in a restricted commercial zone. Then came the fines, so astronomical that their respective governments could barely afford to pay them. Governments would need to allocate entire budgets to cover them. When the Council demanded their immediate return, humanity complied without resistance. The operatives were released with no retaliation, no display of military force. However, alongside them, the Council received a detailed invoice for damages, legal processing fees, and administrative costs associated with their actions. At last, the realization set in: humanity had won the war before it even began. Not through military might, not through diplomacy, but through sheer bureaucratic dominance. Their logistical supremacy, corporate efficiency, and economic momentum had rendered traditional warfare ineffective. The Council had declared war on an opponent that simply did not have the time nor the inclination to participate. As the representatives gathered once more to discuss their next move, one question remained. How do we make them care? The Galactic Council convened once more, the chamber heavy with tension. The war had failed, not in battle but in purpose. Humanity's apathy had neutralized every offensive, every attempt at escalation, and now, with their forces depleted and their treasury drained by legal fees, the Council was left in an impossible position. The debate was long and bitter. Some still argued for total war, insisting that if they threw everything they had at Earth, humanity would be forced to react. But others, those who had studied human behavior, knew better. Humanity would not react with desperation or fear. They would simply absorb the assault, counter with automated defenses, and then file insurance claims for damages. The war would not be won. It would be paid off. The Council had one last option: to surrender. Not in the traditional sense, but in the only way that made sense. They needed humanity's attention, but not through warfare. They needed to enter their world on humanity's terms. The Arbiter himself took the first step. A formal delegation was sent to Earth, not as conquerors, not even as equals, but as applicants. The first response they received was an automated message. Due to high traffic, your request is being processed. Expected response time: 6 to 8 business months. The delegation waited. They had no choice. The Council had no fleet left to threaten, no resources left to sabotage. Every effort to coerce humanity had resulted in nothing but further losses. So they sat in diplomatic offices, filling out forms, filing for permits, requesting negotiations through bureaucratic channels. By the time their request was acknowledged, nearly a year had passed. It was not the Grand Arbiter who received them, not even a ranking government official, but a mid-level corporate liaison named Carson Reed. He shook their hands, offered them coffee, and listened to their concerns with a polite but uninterested expression. "We acknowledge the Galactic Council's grievances," he said, glancing at a holographic document. "Our economic activity has evidently caused disturbances. We're prepared to discuss possible cooperation." The delegation, exhausted and desperate, eagerly leaned forward. "You will negotiate peace." Carson raised an eyebrow. "Peace? No, that was never an issue. You declared war on us. We barely noticed." He scrolled through his display. "We're talking about integrating your economies. You're running an outdated system, inefficient and over-centralized. We've had some of our analysts look into your financial structure, and frankly, it's unsustainable." The delegation exchanged uncertain glances. "You want to integrate us?" "Not at first," Carson clarified. "We'll start with trade agreements, supply chain optimizations. We'll gradually phase out unnecessary bureaucratic redundancies, bring in some of our infrastructure specialists, and streamline your markets. Give it a few decades, and your systems will practically run themselves." A horrified silence filled the room. The Council had sought war. What they had found was assimilation, not through force, not through conquest, but through corporate expansion. Humanity would not take their planets. They would buy them. One of the delegates, his voice strained, asked, "What if we refuse?" Carson smiled, but there was no threat behind it, only quiet confidence. "Then you'll keep losing, not because we'll fight you, but because you can't keep up. Your own people will want better technology, better trade, better stability. You won't be able to compete with what we offer. Eventually, your civilizations will choose integration on their own." The delegates sat in stunned silence. This was not victory, nor was it defeat. It was something else entirely, something far more unsettling. The war had never mattered. Humanity had outgrown war itself. Their battlefield was industry. Their weapons were efficiency and automation. And in this battlefield, the Council had lost before they even knew the fight had begun. It took another 3 months for the agreement to be finalized. The Council, reluctant but with no alternatives, accepted. Trade lanes opened. Infrastructure specialists arrived. The first human-run financial institutions were quietly introduced into alien economies. Within a decade, Galactic Council members were relying on human economic models, their governments increasingly operating under corporate advisory boards, their industries optimized to human standards. The war was not remembered as a conquest. There were no monuments, no battle hymns, no stories of glory. It faded into history as nothing more than an economic transition, a quiet restructuring of an outdated system. Humanity had absorbed an entire interstellar civilization without ever needing to fire a shot. As for the council members, they adapted. Some resisted at first, but the benefits were undeniable. Life improved. Efficiency increased. Even those who had once sought war now found themselves managing trade agreements and corporate investments. The Grand Arbiter, in his final days, was asked what he thought of the war, now that it was over. He had no answer. The war had ended before he even realized it had started. Humanity had not won because they were stronger. They had won because they simply didn't care to fight. They had no need for war when they could simply build a better system and let everyone else come to them. In the end, the greatest battle of the Galactic Council was not one of weapons or strategy. It was a realization that they had never been humanity's enemies. They had only been potential customers.